Das ist noch nicht die offizielle Begrüßung. Vielen Dank, dass Sie hier sind zu diesem doch etwas ungewöhnlichen Ereignis. Sehr selten, dass britische Politiker nach Deutschland kommen. Ich darf als erstes den Präsidenten bitten, für uns heute zu eröffnen, und dann switchen wir auch in die englische Sprache. Okay.
So then I will start in English. A very warm welcome. I'm very happy and pleased to have you here at European University Viadrina, Frankfurt on the Oder. It's an honor and a big pleasure, and I'm thanking all my colleagues from Sprachenzentrum, especially the head of our Sprachenzentrum, Herrn Vogel. And so the topic is of course sad, but I worked myself for mostly three years in Oxford. I never could have imagined that something like this would happen, so I'm very interested in your words personally. And let me introduce to you in a few words this university. Viadrina was founded in 1506 as the first Brandenburg university, so it's an old university where Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach studied, Heine von Kleist, who was born here, and Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt. And after after Napoleonic devastation of Prussia, Wilhelm von Humboldt became Minister of Science and founded a new university at this unimportant place about 80 kilometers in the west, today called by his name. And Viadrina was transferred in 1811 to Breslau, what was Germany at that time, so Wrocław University are we somehow as well. And in 1991 it was refounded by the engagement of the citizens, so it was really a bottom-up process, what was very unusual. There's three faculties: cultural studies, business school and law, and the Collegium Polonicum on the Polish side. And on the Polish side, also tendencies of Brexit now in Czech Republic, in Hungary, all around. So the topic is not only now connected to Great Britain. A very warm welcome, and so the word is yours, I guess. No, not yet. Oh, not yet.
This is the microphone, okay? Can you all hear? That's very important. Hearing is always very important. A few words of introduction. And dear Daniel, thank you very much for coming. Dear Barbara, where are you? His partner in crime, dear President, dear students, dear colleagues, and of course, dear guests who actually accepted our invitation. And thank you very much for doing so. And it is indeed, for us, it's a remarkable event. So a warm welcome to you in the name of my colleagues from the Language Center, the Viadrina, and thank you very much for coming to this very exciting, as you will find out, corner of Europe. By the way, I have to tell you, Daniel was actually supposed to come in June, remember? We had already fixed the date, and we hadn't booked a flight, but almost close to booking a flight. And then Theresa May messed it all up.
Yes.
By calling this very stupid election, I mean, on her terms, a very stupid election where she actually lost, when she lost her majority. And then the Queen messed it up because she had to postpone her speech.
Yes.
So this is how come he's here now, and we're glad that he only wanted to postpone and not cancel his appearance here. And I hope you see this as a kind of relaxing time of relaxation. Your visit to the Viadrina, away from the craziness and turmoil of Westminster. So shut your smartphone off and enjoy what's happening. Now, why would a language center invite a British politician to talk about Brexit? What does Brexit have to do with us? I think to sum it all up, the current political situation or political trends in Europe, of which the idea of Brexit, I think, is an essential part or a symptom, goes against the values which we believe in and which we are part and parcel, or which are part and parcel of our professional ethos. The Language Center here at the Viadrina is presumably the most international part of the university, I have to say. Colleagues from 17 different countries work successfully together to assist our students in breaking down borders which a lot of people now want to be re-erected, and barriers of communication between cultures. And empathy seems to be lost on the way. And again, that's what we want to instill in our students. In much better words, I think John le Carré, the famous spy novelist, who in a speech at the German embassy on why one should learn German, he actually speaks German. Unfortunately, Daniel doesn't, but there's time, Daniel. And he addressed this issue. John le Carré addressed the issue close to our heart and the essential connection between language and politics. And I quote, "Without clear language, there is no standard of truth, and that's what language means to a linguist. Those who teach language, those who cherish its accuracy and meaning and beauty are the custodians of truth." And if they teach German, and you can replace German by any other language that we teach, and teach it in my beleaguered country, they are quite particularly prized. Every time I hear a British politician utter the fatal words, "Let me be very clear, these days I reach for my revolver." I didn't know you had gun laws that were so liberal. Anyway, I'm absolutely convinced that John le Carré would not reach for his pistol if he had the chance to listen to our guest speaker today. A few words of introduction. Daniel was born in Beckenham in 1956. His father, and this is where the name comes from, draftsman, that's the English translation, was an Austrian immigrant who had to flee Nazi Austria for political reasons, I understand. Yeah. And his mother was a descendant of agricultural workers from Cambridge. And I think this probably explains a lot about Daniel's political stance now and his view on Brexit. In 1976, Zeichner came to the University of Cambridge to read history at King's College. And like any sensible Brit, what you do afterwards, you go into IT. Which is, of course, a cultural difference, because in Britain you do, scholastic philosophy, and then you work for the post office. In Germany, we still think in terms of quite career as a straight way to your career. At King's, Zeichner met Barbara, who became his life partner, and they both joined the Labour Party in 1979, if my sources are correct. Your first job, as I said, after graduation was in the IT business as a computer programmer, so I'm quite happy to have you here, just in case anything goes wrong.
Thank you.
And you worked specifically in the public service in IT. And to cut your long political career short, Daniel was elected a member of Parliament for Cambridge in 2015, and he also became the Shadow Transport Secretary, a position that doesn't exist in German politics. It's the equivalent in the opposition. You have equivalents who actually then take their role in the debate with the ministers. And a post from which you resigned, actually, this year. But in the election, he retained his seat in Parliament with an even greater majority. And among those who supported him during his election campaign was the well-known and eminent Cambridge professor Stephen Hawking. As I'd written in my invitation, Daniel's position on Brexit is crystal clear, and if I may quote from your contribution to the debate on Brexit in Westminster on triggering Article 50, and I quote, Daniel, "My position on Europe has always been clear. I am passionate pro-European and a straightforward politician. I promised the people of Cambridge I would stick to my principles and I would do right by our city. That means voting with my conscience and doing all I can to oppose the Tories' extreme Brexit, which would, in my opinion, damage our economy, our security, and our society as a whole. So you can't be any clearer than that. And it's a stance that we, and this is why this is a political as well as an academic event, is very close to what we believe in. Thank you very much, Daniel, for coming, and we're looking forward to your talk. And by the way, this is my friend and colleague, Richard Bland, who will join me on the podium for the discussion later on. Richard is interesting in that he has a British degree in law and a PhD in German, and he worked in Britain, and he's one of our teachers of English in the Language Center. So, okay, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you all for giving up your time to come and listen to me and to discuss with me about these very important issues today. Let me start with a couple of apologies. First of all, I have a German-sounding name, but I'm not speaking German, and I'm very sorry about that, but it's probably part of the experience of many people who left countries to go to another country, that they tend very much to be brought up using the language of that new country. I've always regretted that I didn't speak German, but so for today I will have to speak to you in English, I'm afraid. My second apology is actually on behalf of my country, in the sense of the very foolish thing we are doing in terms of Brexit at the moment, and I will say more about that as we go on. But the title of my talk is about Brexit and higher education, so I'm going to say a little bit about our university system, which I hope will be of some interest to you. I've been learning about your university as well, and can I also say how inspiring your university is, and the aims and aspirations that you have here. If only more people in my country could understand what you are trying to do to bring people together rather than to divide. So I applaud you very much for that. As you have heard, I represent a city, Cambridge, which is renowned worldwide for one of its very, very famous universities, but we have two universities in the city of Cambridge, both very good, but different. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. We have many undergraduates, something like 30,000 young people in the city of Cambridge, out of a city which only has a population of 110,000, 120,000. So we're a young city. It's a great city to live in. For Budge and I, we met at King's College, Cambridge, many years ago in the late 70s. It's a wonderful city to live in, although very expensive to live in, and has transport and environmental challenges, and also has social divisions, as do many places. But we also have a very strong research record, many postgraduates, postdocs, and now many new innovative researchers, particularly in life sciences and the biomedical field, but also the social sciences too. So it is a great city of which I am very proud. And probably partly because of that, because it's a confident city, it's a well-educated city. When Britain came to have the referendum last year, the vote was overwhelming in Cambridge. 74% of people in Cambridge voted to stay in the European Union. Sadly, that was not the same across the rest of the country, and you only have to go a few miles from Cambridge to find a very different political view, a very right-wing, nationalist view. We had a party called the United Kingdom Independence Party, which led the campaign for Brexit, and their national headquarters is only 10 miles to the north of Cambridge. So a very real geographical division, very close. And possibly the big division in Britain, and possibly other parts of the world now, is the cities. When Budge and I were wandering through Berlin yesterday, the first time we've ever visited that great city, we felt very at home. It felt to us like many parts that we know in London and love. It felt like Cambridge. When we go to other parts of our own country, we do not feel so much at home, and that perhaps is the key division. As you've heard, My political view on Brexit has been clear from the outset. I promised the people of Cambridge that I would oppose Brexit at every point, and I will continue to do so. And let me just sound an optimistic note. It is going so badly at the moment that there is still hope that Britain will come to its senses in the next year or so. I have to say I'm not sure how much patience the rest of Europe has with Britain on this, and I hope you will be patient with us as we try and work our way through this very foolish decision. But do not assume that it is a completely lost cause. There are many of us who would absolutely understand why it is a foolish thing, and we are fighting it in the UK Parliament. Let me say a bit, though, about our universities. That is just a picture of a meeting that I addressed outside one of the buildings in the centre of Cambridge just a couple of weeks ago, when people from across the east of England came to rally in support of our cause to stop Brexit. But on universities, there are some figures there which show just how big and important the university sector is within the United Kingdom. We have 1.75 million undergraduates, 500,000 postgraduates. We have many students from the European Union. We have even more students from outside the European Union. We have quite a range of what we call higher education providers, spread from the old traditional universities through to newer universities. And one of the reasons that we have increased the number of people going into higher education is that our view is that it's good in itself. People are better educated. That's good. But also that it's been good for our economy, particularly as Britain struggles to find its place in the modern world. We believe we need to have better skills, higher educated workforce, because our productivity levels are still rather low in the United Kingdom. It's also a huge employer, so a very important part of our local economies. And the interesting figure I think you'll see there is that the number of academic staff is roughly the same as the number of academic staff. So a huge number of people, very important contributor. In fact, higher education is Britain's 5th biggest export earner. It is one of the things that the United Kingdom has been very good at. And we think it also makes for a much better country because we have so many people coming from around the world. But different kinds of universities. And here you'll see two pictures. The one at the top is the picture of the university in Cambridge that Budge and I went to in 1976 as optimistic, idealistic young people. That was just before Margaret Thatcher got elected, so that our expectations fell a bit a few years later as Britain went backwards in our view. But that is a particularly beautiful image of King's College Chapel, some wonderful buildings in the University of Cambridge. It's a university based on a series of colleges, relatively small institutions where people know each other. There's a feeling of camaraderie. It builds academic excellence and is a complicated system, and there's a division between the colleges and the university, which is an umbrella organisation over the top of it, which is a different way of organising from the one below, where you'll see there a much newer university, much more likely to be doing what you would probably see as technical skills rather than more traditional academic skills. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher muddied the water by basically renaming many of those polytechnics and technical educational institutions, calling them all universities. I'm afraid it probably fed into the rather traditional British class system, its snobbishness, which meant that somehow it was all about having a university degree, which undervalued the role of technical skills and qualifications, and that has probably done our economy a considerable amount of harm, in fact. And there is now a debate about whether we should separate them out again, and there's probably a lot to be said for that. What it has meant also is that a lot of the newer universities have struggled financially, and some of them actually are facing quite acute difficulties at the moment. You will know that our universities have gone through a painful period of debate about how much we charge undergraduates in particular, and a lot of our young people at the moment face very, very high fees for attending university. We have had a loans system which has left many of our young people heavily indebted, and it is a very big political debate in Britain as to what we should do in the future, whether we should change that system, whether we can afford to do so, because it would cost quite a lot of money, but Other countries, like your own, manage to do it. We've also got a problem about what we might do if we change that with people who've already incurred considerable amounts of debt. So higher education is a real political battlefield in Britain at the moment. I should say for my own part, that I think it probably is time that we looked again at our system of fees, not necessarily to get rid of them completely, but to reduce them substantially. At the moment, undergraduates are being expected to pay £9,000 per year in fees. That's probably nearly 10,000 euros. And so many are graduating with debts of possibly £50,000, many of whom will not be able to pay that off in their lifetime. Just another word about the hierarchy of the universities within the United Kingdom. We have a number of universities which consider themselves to be almost part of an elite group of universities. It's called the Russell Group. The two universities which people have generally heard of around the world, the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford, both established many, many centuries ago, 12th, 13th century institutions. And in many ways, particularly Cambridge, the city has grown up around the university, and to many people's minds is synonymous. But what we saw, particularly at the end of the 19th century in the United Kingdom after the Industrial Revolution or during our Industrial Revolution, was new universities growing up in the great industrial cities, Manchester, Nottingham, other places, right around the country. And we've got a succession of universities formed since then, places like Norwich, which Budge and I know very well, all of them excellent in different ways, but all of them facing a range of challenges at the moment. But perhaps what they've all had in common in the last 20, 30 years is the relationship with the European Union. And many of you will be familiar with the Erasmus programme. At the moment, there's much discussion in Britain about our relationship with the European Union in future, particularly around research funding and Horizon 2020. The general view in Britain is that the success of our universities has largely been founded upon, in recent times, in research terms, the collaborations we have with other parts of the world. And Horizon 2020 is certainly in Britain has been felt to be hugely successful, and Britain does very, very well out of Horizon 2020. In fact, we receive more back in funding from the European Union than we put in. Now, the trouble is, people in our universities understand this. The wider population finds it much too complicated generally, and it's not much explained to people. So we are very concerned at the moment to look at ways in which, whatever happens in terms of Brexit, whether we can find a way of staying within the European Union or whether we have to negotiate a new relationship, of finding a way of being part of Horizon 2020 or FP9 and the successive frameworks in the future, because we believe it's not just in Britain's interests, but actually we believe it's actually in the interests of our European partners as well. Now, whether we will be able to secure that, of course, is one of the key issues, and one of the big problems in the Brexit debate at the moment is Theresa May seems to have a particular fixation about the European Court of Justice and how Britain must not remain a part of it or subject to its rulings. Our understanding, and we're all learning a lot more about how the European Union works at the moment, I can assure you most parliamentarians in Westminster had only a fairly hazy idea of this a year or two ago, but we now spend much of our time poring over the fine detail. Our understanding is that disputes, and there always will be disputes and arguments, particularly within Horizon 2020, are subject ultimately to rulings by the European Court of Justice. So we're going to have to try and find some way through that from Britain's point of view, or we will find that we are outside it. And this is I'm afraid, one of the options that Britain faces at the moment. It is extremely complicated, many of these relationships. Trying to untangle them separately to create a new set of arrangements, many of us believe is highly unlikely to be achieved by March 2019, which is only some 17, 18 months away now. So the questions that many people are asking me in places like Cambridge is, well, what happens? What happens in 12 or 13 months' time? Actually, it is already happening, because what we are finding is, sadly, a lot of my colleagues in the University of Cambridge, when they're bidding for new research projects at the moment, looking for people to collaborate with around Europe, partners quite reasonably are saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen, therefore we'll actually rather work with somebody else. So the idea that Brexit is happening in a year or two's time, actually it's already happening now, and it's already doing, I would say, considerable damage to the United Kingdom. But these things are complicated, and as I say, they're not the kind of things that necessarily get reported on a regular basis in our national newspapers, where the level of discourse is generally on a fairly shallow populist level. You have to talk to the people who are actually involved to find out what's really going on. Now, we've had lots of people campaigning in the United Kingdom, in Britain. Sadly, my reflection on a lot of the campaigns that we are running at the moment is it tends to be audiences like this, where people who believe strongly in the advantages of being part of the European Union and talking to other people who believe strongly in the advantages of being in the European Union. The difficulty we have is trying to explain to our fellow citizens outside the university sector exactly how advantageous it is for us to be part of the European Union. I'm told that 4/5 of internationally co-authored papers include an author from the European Union. Over half of UK scientific publications between 2008 and 2014 had foreign co-authors, and 4 of the top 5 collaborative countries that we work with were other EU countries. That's a huge proportion, but the difficulty, as I say, is explaining that to people who are not involved in any way with the research sector. We have very large numbers of people in and around Cambridge who are from other European Union countries. Around 14% of the research and teaching staff in the UK higher education are from other European Union countries. Around Cambridge, I'm told about 9,000 European Union, non-UK European Union nationals. And I have people coming into my vice sessions on a weekly basis asking me, what is going to happen? What is going to happen in 18 months' time? Am I going to be able to stay here? And the truth is, at the moment, we don't actually know. Many of us believe that the very first thing that the UK government should have done was to guarantee the future rights of people who are EU nationals living in Britain. That would have given certainty for the future. Unfortunately, that's not been the approach our government has taken, my government has taken. Not my government, actually, the UK's government. The UK's government has taken. And equally, there are 3.2 million EU citizens in the United Kingdom, but a million British citizens living in other European Union countries. Their future is equally uncertain. They're very unhappy about that. So 4 million people whose future is uncertain. And the government at the moment, a year, nearly 18 months on from that decision, still saying we're close to having a deal. This is what Theresa May says every week when we challenge her in Parliament. This week she says it's within touching distance of having an agreement. Is it? We don't know. The truth is we don't know. We think, my party, the Labour Party, thinks she should make a unilateral announcement that whatever happens, people's future is secure. Our belief is that actually that would draw a positive response from other countries. We see no reason why that wouldn't lead to the same kind of offer being given to our people. But we don't think this can be used, people can be used as a set of bargaining chips in a negotiation. And when you look at the complexities of many people's lives, the questions of what happens to their children, what happens, what rights and obligations are left for them in future, you can see how difficult it is to untangle 40 years of close integration. Another challenge for an area like Cambridge is just what will happen if we don't get some of these things resolved in terms of the people we need to continue the excellent research we're doing. Just around Cambridge, there are a string of science parks with very, very high-level research being done at the moment. There is an institution called the Sanger Institute, which is carrying out very detailed research into the human genome. Fantastic scientific breakthroughs being made in the last decade, which has transformed and will transform our approach to medicine in the future. But much of that research is being done by technicians who come from other European countries. Thousands and thousands of people doing detailed work. We're very, very happy to have people coming. People often come for a few years and then go back, which is great. They get skills. We get the benefit of their skills in the meantime. These are not particularly well-paid people. Sometimes people think this issue of people coming and going is just the people at the very, very top. It is partly, but far more people are the technicians who do the day-to-day work, often are earning under £30,000 a year, so they're not superly well paid. Some of the people who are in favour of Brexit in the UK say, oh, well, these people can be treated in just the same way as people coming from outside the European Union. But the problem is, many of those people can't come into Britain either because our visa regime is so complicated and restrictive. And what I'm told by people like the Sanger Institute outside Cambridge is there's just no way the visa system will work. So unless there's a substantial change in the UK immigration system, what we will be finding in a few months' time, and in fact are already finding, is that people will no longer be coming to replace the people who are going. And I'm afraid people are leaving the UK at the moment, partly because people do no longer feel welcome in the way that they used to. A few years ago, it was just not an issue. People came and went. Cambridge is a thriving, multicultural, international city. People happy to be there. But I've lost count of the number of people who have now told me, it's changed. I no longer feel welcome here. I was talking to a German professor a few weeks ago who was having his leaving party in one of the colleges, and he had been at the University of Cambridge for 20, 30 years. He said he never expected to leave. But now, actually, given the feeling around the place, he said, I got an offer from a university in France. I think I'd rather be there. He said, it's with a heavy heart that I'm leaving because this was the country I expected to live in for the rest of my life. It's a tragedy for Britain, a tragedy that we are doing so much harm to ourselves. So it's not conventional for UK politicians to go to other countries and talk down their own country. But I'm afraid I have to do that because this is what is happening. And I think it's important that others hear just how badly we feel, those of us who do not subscribe to this approach, just how badly we feel about how people are being treated at the moment. So that all could sound rather depressing if one was, if one wasn't in the end an optimist. It is beginning to gradually perhaps dawn on people just what is likely to be happening in the months and years ahead. Our newspapers, and we have right-wing populist newspapers like the Daily Mail, who will always report the worst stories about what's happening in terms of this debate. But even they are beginning to ask themselves questions about how this is actually going to work. Every sector you look at, the same stories are emerging. Yesterday, Budge and I flew from Stansted Airport in the east of England to Berlin. Actually, it's not at all clear what the rules will be for airlines like Ryanair in a few months' time. The chief executives of most of the airlines are warning the government that unless there are new arrangements put in place within the next few months, they schedule their flights a year ahead. So again, this is not something that can wait till March 2019. And the extreme example is that if there is no deal, if Britain leaves the European Union without a proper set of arrangements, that a lot of the aviation agreements at that point would lapse, and we would have to go back to the agreements from the era before the European Union. Now that will be legally contested in many cases, and it's unclear quite how that would work. But it could well be that some of the airlines will decide it's not worth the legal risk. So quite simply, the planes might be grounded on the 1st of April 2019. Now, for a country like Britain that relies heavily on, not just on people coming and going, but actually relies heavily on traded goods coming and going, it is an unimaginable prospect that we could be in that position. Within a couple of days, the United Kingdom would be in total crisis, and we would be facing a very, very difficult political situation. Now, the assumption is The assumption is that cannot be allowed to happen. There will have to be arrangement, or have to be a deal. But what I say to people is, you can say that, but there has to be a legal basis for that deal. And actually, when you look at the complexities that would be needed to create this transitional set of arrangements that people talk about, it is not entirely clear that that can just be done overnight. The political leaders might want it to be done overnight, but it has to be agreed by a whole range, in some cases by all other EU countries, sometimes by the European Parliament. We are in very treacherous, dangerous water, in my view. And as I say, it is beginning to dawn on some of my colleagues in the UK Parliament that this may not be an entirely sensible thing to be doing. Now, as Thomas has already outlined to you, I intended to come and speak to you back in June. Earlier this year, it was very unclear. In the British system, we don't have what are called fixed-term parliaments. We were supposed to have, but the Prime Minister broke that convention and was able to ram through plans to have an early general election. She went to the country back in June on the basis that she wanted a clear mandate to negotiate with the European Union. That's what she claimed she wanted. The British people delivered a very mixed message, having said in the referendum they wanted to leave the European Union. When the Prime Minister said, okay, now give me the mandate to do it properly, the British people kind of said, well, maybe. And I think that's actually rather important, because some people say to me, well, you're ignoring the democratically expressed will of the people in the referendum. I say the world has changed since then, in lots of ways. One of the ways was the general election, where, as you'll see from the slide, my party did much better than many people expected. And now the Conservatives no longer have a clear majority in the House of Commons, which makes negotiating and getting agreements on Brexit much, much more difficult for them in the Parliament. But it's also sent a message to other European leaders that Theresa May no longer has that clear mandate. But what I'd also say has changed is the election of Trump in America, because one of the premises of many people in Britain was, well, maybe we never were entirely European. And it's a fair point. Britain's membership of the European Union has been marked by 40 years of a lack of enthusiasm, I would say. And that has been one of the political problems. That if you spend 40 years, as many in Britain have done, complaining about the European Union, and you then go and ask the people, what do you think? You can hardly be surprised if a lot of people say, well, for 40 years you've been telling us it's not very good. Now you want us to vote for it. So the political class has, all of us collectively in Britain, bear some responsibility for all this. But what some of the people said was, okay, if we turn our back on Europe, we can rebuild our relationship with our former members of the Commonwealth. I was going to say, go back to the colonial period. I don't think that's quite how Australia and other countries see the relationship in the modern world. In fact, our links through the Commonwealth have not clearly going to be the way forward for Britain in the future, but some thought Britain's economic model, social model, was far closer to the United States than it had ever been to the European model. So let's build a new relationship with the United States. And of course, people, particularly like our slightly controversial Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, who wherever he goes seems to do more harm. That's a slightly partisan point, but I think actually the evidence is fairly clear. He goes around insulting people. Possibly with America, possibly with Hillary Clinton as president, it might have been possible to forge a new relationship. I think the election of Trump changed all that. So when in Britain we look around for a new set of partners that we are going to be building this new relationship with, I think it's pretty unclear who that is going to be with. And I think that gives a very good reason to me for saying it is time for us to think again. So in conclusion, let me say finally that I'm a Labour politician, I'm a left-of-centre politician. I always believe you must remain optimistic and positive about what can be achieved through dialogue with others. My message to you is that there are different voices in Britain at the moment. Yes, the government continues with its mantra that Brexit means Brexit, whatever that means. But there are many other voices who are beginning to say, well, let's look in detail at what this new world is going to look like. Tony Blair, previous UK Prime Minister a month or two ago said something very sensible in my view, which was that basically his view was that we will end up with something different from where we were before, but maybe not so very different. Maybe Britain becomes some kind of associate member of the European Union. The truth is, we were not part of the euro. We did not sign up to Schengen. Britain has been in the slow lane in a multi-tier Europe for some time. Many of us fully understand and appreciate that actually we have been a block on European integration. People in Britain have never understood those in the European Union who actually understand the European project is a positive project. I would say it's our lack of understanding of history, possibly partly because Britain was not invaded in the wars of the last century. For me, during the referendum campaign, the issue of peace was the most pressing one, possibly partly because of my personal family background. Seeing how much people, and standing where we are today, Thomas, absolutely makes the point to me. Seeing what happened in Europe in the last century should surely be a warning to people. Do not take peace for granted. Politics is needed to resolve the disputes that people have. I think actually the European Union has been a huge success. To bring together so many countries and find a democratic way of resolving differences is something to be applauded. It's not easy to do. I sometimes look at some of my local councils. We tried recently to get 21 councils to come to an agreement on setting up a new regional system. It collapsed within days because we couldn't get 21 councils to agree with each other. I did say to them occasionally, do you realise the European Union is actually more than 21? And we have managed to fashion a system that by and large works, that allows us to redistribute resources across the continent, to look forward, to build the kind of infrastructure that's necessary to make Europe a power in the modern world when other continents are quite clearly going to be doing so well in this century. Absolutely, Britain needs to be a part of Europe. The question I find myself asking is, what can Britain contribute to Europe other than to be a brake? And I think that's something that people in Britain need to think about too. I hope Britain will change its mind at some point. I ask for tolerance from you for our stupidity through this period. But what I would say is, I think Britain does still have something to contribute to the European Union in future. We are a significant economic power still. We are still a significant number of people. And when America has recovered from its idiocy, I believe we will still be an important link between Europe and America, because however much the world is changing, actually the dynamics of the last century haven't entirely gone. And we do still need a relationship between Europe and America. And Britain, I believe, can play an important part in that role. So I don't think it's over. I think it's going to be a tough fight in the United Kingdom over the next few months. But bit by bit, those of us who want to stay in the European Union are beginning to win the argument. The public opinion polls are beginning to change. My view in politics is the politicians must never get too far away from the people they claim to represent. So it's no good as just doing a political deal to stop Brexit. We've actually got to persuade the British people, not all of them, because we'll never persuade all of them, we've got to persuade enough of them that actually this is not a sensible thing for them to be doing in the future. And I think public opinion is shifting. So in conclusion, Mr. President and Thomas, thank you for listening to what I've had to say about this. I'll be fascinated to hear your view, because in Britain we're totally self-obsessed at the moment. We're only seeing it from our perspective. I really want to hear what you have to say too. And thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for tolerating, as I say, Britain's peculiarities over the last 40 years. And I hope we can build a better future with Britain in Europe in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your very open and very optimistic outlook on things. I would like to open the debate by asking Richard for a kickoff.
Thank you. Yes, I think it would be nice if we could get questions from the audience as well shortly, both to do with Brexit issues, European Union, or to do with higher education issues connected with Brexit or otherwise. It's useful having Daniel here from Cambridge. We've got the education perspective as well as the political perspective. If I might just start with where you finished, really, which was on an optimistic note. I'm just reflecting a little bit on the division that Brexit seems to have opened up in British society on a greater scale than we had before. And I just wonder if it's going to be so easy, even for the Labour Party. The Labour Party has to do a lot of soul-searching itself. It has the same problems as the SPD in Germany in terms of finding an electoral base because of shifts in population, what we all know about the way poor people feel that they're not at all represented by political movements. So I just wonder if I might throw in there a personal anecdote, my own personal experiences. I recently went back for a 50th birthday party, and it was in the broad commuter belt around London, and nearly everybody at that party was under the age of 55, and nearly everybody at that party had been to Oxford. It was a kind of an old boys network, if you like. And nearly everybody came up to me and says, "Oh, please do apologize to your German friends." The point I'm making is that I felt like I was in a bubble. I was in my little comfort zone. And when I go back to my parents, where they have moved to, in an area which I am sure is almost entirely pro-Brexit, I just wonder how you can bring those two worlds together again with Jeremy's vision.
Well, it is an extremely good question. I mean, the Brits are notorious for being apologetic, so we do apology very well. But it is the political dilemma of our times, and I think I hinted earlier that the division between urban areas like Budge and I share our time largely between North London, Camden, and Cambridge areas. As I say, probably exactly why we felt so comfortable coming to Berlin. There is a huge gulf. I don't actually think the referendum was about Europe. It was actually about immigration, and it was about social division. And the Labour Party must speak for people who are left behind. And many of my colleagues who come from areas who are not like the university cities, and the university cities are across Britain pretty much the same, pro-Remain. But for other areas, people are deeply conflicted as representatives. Most of them, well, all of them virtually, strongly in favour of remaining in the European Union, but in some cases their constituencies voting 70% to leave, exactly as you've explained. Now, how do we explain to those people the dangers ahead? I think in the end it does come down to the economics, because I think as people begin to see what is opening up before us, I think people are becoming more anxious. Now, you could say this was all explained to people before the referendum, and one of the most difficult moments was seeing people in Sunderland who rely very heavily on jobs at Nissan's major investments in the car industry in those areas, where Nissan had been very, very clear explaining to people the dangers and the risks, yet people overwhelmingly voted to leave. And there is a real difficulty for many of us in the sense that you can't just go around to people saying, "We know best." Because the more you do that, the more people kick back, because this is partly what this has been about. So you're absolutely right, it is the challenge. But I do think that if we keep going back to those basic points about the economic problems that will be posed, plus we have to show that something is going to change. And this is where I suppose I might be treading on slightly more tricky ground, but free movement within the European Union, I think, is not just an issue for the United Kingdom. I think it's an issue for other European Union members as well. And whilst obviously the four principles are absolutely sacrosanct to the European Union, and I entirely understand that and appreciate it, I think we've got to reflect on the fact that quite clearly there are movements, nationalist movements across Europe, which are going to go on building possibility and electoral popularity unless we can find a political response to this which reflects the fact that people are not always comfortable with the pace of change. We've seen it in Britain, where communities have suddenly had very large numbers of people coming from other areas, and it creates tension and difficulty. So I think there is a challenge for European politicians as well, not just to ignore this and turn their back on it. So David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, part of the deal he tried to fashion was around some of these issues, but he didn't find a way of getting anything which sounded nearly strong enough to persuade people. So I suppose that's a challenge I would pass back to other European politicians. Maybe you've got to look at some kinds of limitations on freedom of movement, whether they are temporary movements. I mean, the irony is that we do actually have legislation within the European Union which allows a lot of this to be done, but that's not the way people feel. Most people think it's an open door policy. It isn't, but that's how people feel about it. And unless we actually are honest about the migration issues and reflect on those with people, then it will be difficult to win that argument.
Questions? We'll take questions from... Yeah.
You make a very good point. I mean, partly, it does seem to me the last 20, 30 years have been a period of astonishing transition. And in a way, it's been a period of adjustment. Where Budge and I live, we see Polish people coming to live very close to where we are. And what's more is we see people coming and going very quickly. And what is interesting about the Brexit debate at the moment is the politicians are talking, but people are already acting. Exactly as I've been saying. People who are working in our restaurants, our pubs, doing the jobs that many English workers won't do, are already moving back to Poland. And of course, partly that's because Poland is now doing so much better. And that's a good thing, I would say, in terms of the success of the European Union. So to some extent, maybe the last 20 years, Britain has actually had an artificial bonus because the accession countries produced very skilled, hard-working people who were prepared to come to Britain. The British people didn't understand that in a lot of cases. Don't understand actually quite why our economy has done okay. Well, now we may find out the very, very hard way, hence the title of the talk. We may be in for a big shock because most people, to be honest, most of us don't understand how the economy works. I often, over my life, have reflected on our extraordinarily high standard of living. And I look at what I've done through my life, and I think, well, did I really earn this? Did I really deserve it? And, I mean, this is an important point in terms of the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world as well. But what we're seeing is an equalization within Europe, and that's good for security, because basically prosperous countries tend not to fight so much, go to war with each other so much, so that's good. It's obviously good because it's better for people to be prosperous. But it then does beg the question, why should people stay? And I don't have an answer to that, because I fear many people will very quickly come to the conclusion that actually they'd be better off. I mean, obviously we've seen the big devaluation of the pound, which has made it less attractive for people to be coming to Britain to work. There is potentially a big shock for the British economy. Now, the trouble is that the optimist in me says people will think, well, we made a mistake, so we actually need to do something about it. The negative side is that there is a growing sense in Britain that somehow Europe has done this to us. We're seeing in some of the newspapers at the moment, it's all a horrible plot to do Britain down. So it is extraordinary how an act of self-harm can then be blamed on other people. But that is quite often what happens. So the optimists, like me, have got to be careful that we hope people will draw the right conclusions from what is happening. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that people will draw exactly the opposite conclusion. And historically, of course, what we know is whenever times get tough, the first people who are blamed are people who are different, outsiders, foreigners, whatever you want, and then you get worse social tensions. So that is why this is so important politically at the moment, that Britain finds a way through this, a sensible way to come to accommodation. Now, let's assume for a minute that Brexit does happen, because that still seems to be the most likely outcome. What I've said to my friends, I suppose, from the very beginning is, well, actually what needs to happen is we need to leave but not leave. In other words, the British people think we've left, but by and large, the relationships are left in place, because most people don't understand them. So I think it's highly likely that we will be leaving the European Parliament. I think it's highly likely that we won't be flying the European flag, although I have to say we don't fly it very much. I was very struck. I was very struck outside the Reichstag yesterday, see the German flag and the European flag flying together, which I thought, which I thought was wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. Well, indeed. But you see, Britain, I myself immediately fall into it. Britain, the United Kingdom, we have a very troubled sense of our own identity in Britain. We're having exactly the same discussions with Scotland, Wales. We talk about Brexit, but it's actually the United Kingdom that's leaving Northern Ireland on the island of Ireland in an almost impossible position because the border issues cannot be resolved. But for most people, when they wake up in the morning, don't worry about these things. It is still a very simplistic, quite often nationalistic thing. They just think Britain, England, proud of our country. Everyone should always be proud of their community, of course, but not in a hostile way to other communities. And that, when people are under pressure, is what often happens. So, in a long answer to your question, but in essence, the only way we will keep people like your uncle, was it? Is if we can continue to make it economically attractive for people to come to Britain or stay in Britain, but also deal with what is becoming a poison in some places in terms of the unpleasantness that we're seeing in some areas. Not in universities, of course, because in universities people are absolutely progressive, educated people will be fine. But on the streets, we're seeing racism, xenophobia rising, and that, quite understandably, will cause people to leave.
Lucas.
Excuse me?
We have a microphone, actually. It's probably easier.
Yeah, so I'm Russian national, actually. So I do understand all the problems when you have to immigrate to another European state. Yeah, and I wish you never to go through all the proceedings of getting a visa and having, finding a reason to stay in a European country. In fact, I've never been to Britain because it's not Schengen zone, so I would rather not go, actually, because, and so it's really interesting for me how Britain was so easy to decide on leaving the EU, even though it's so much easier for the British people to travel around Europe and then walk if they want to, for instance, walk in Berlin, or even if they want, the art people, because I think the art migration is really high in Germany, because a lot of people are going to Berlin, for instance, and then it would be so much better for them to stay in the EU and then, continue to do arts. So my question was, do you really think that Britain can roll back and go back to staying in the EU?
Well, I hope so. But if we don't stay within the European Union, then the question is, what kind of relationship do we have? And what I would hope is it is as close as it can be to what we had before. So there's kind of a spectrum between what has sometimes been called very hard Brexit, where we either crash out or we don't have an agreement, or we have a whole series of agreements which, to be honest, probably wouldn't change things very much, but we would actually be outside the European Union. So part of the debate is about that. But I think the point you made earlier was an interesting one about the ability to move around. What we're seeing is a generational difference in Britain. Older people are far more likely to be keen to leave the European Union. Younger people, who are much more likely to have travelled or to want to travel, are far more likely to be in favour of staying just because they want to be mobile. And this is one of those very difficult things. If some of us wanted to lower the voting age to 16 for the referendum, because we were partly because we think it's a good idea, but partly because actually more young people almost certainly would be more positive. That again is what makes me optimistic, because actually what we are seeing is the future is going to be many more people, I think, more mobile in the world. I think that's absolutely inevitable. So actually these barriers have got to come down. So the political argument is a different one, but in reality, the world's becoming a smaller place. And it's a good thing, because it means more people talk to each other, more people understand each other's cultures. We learn so much more. The reason places like Cambridge and London are wonderful, desirable places to live in is precisely because there are lots of different cultures, lots of different experiences, and we're so much better off from that. What we need to do is share that with the people who've been excluded, because I think once they are included, then they would share that optimism and confidence.
Can I just throw in some sort of, or pour a little bit of salt into the wound? I mean, it's all nice and easy to say, well, you're optimistic, but look at your own party. I mean, the Labour Party is divided in itself, isn't it? The Labour Party is not very clear on Brexit. How do you see that? How much of a minority voice are you within your own party?
Actually, the Labour Party is hardly divided at all. Of the MPs, there are about 7 or 8 out of about 260 who take a different view. And many of them take a very old view, which goes back to when Britain first joined the European Union, which was that it was seen as a capitalist club. In other words, they're coming, some of them, not all of them, but most of them are coming at it from a much further left perspective, which, I mean, I think one can intellectually understand some of that, but there was a big moment for the Labour movement in the UK when particularly Jacques Delors talked about social Europe, because the left in Britain took a hammering during the Thatcher period and then suddenly realised that maybe the European Union could come to the rescue, which is also partly, of course, why the right in Britain didn't like the European Union, because they see the European social model as completely different from their very free market approach. So you're right to say there are different views within the Labour Party, but the overwhelming majority of the parliamentary party is very strongly in favour of Remain. Individual members of the Labour Party have shown themselves to be very strongly in favour of Remain. All the polling of Labour Party members shows that. But Labour voters are more split, and that goes back to Richard's point. And that is because, quite understandably, given Labour largely represents poorer areas of the country, for all the reasons we know, people who are feeling poorer and more vulnerable are worried about immigration. So you're right, there's a conundrum for Labour, but even Jeremy Corbyn, who of course has notoriously been, questions of his enthusiasm have been raised, even when he was asked the other week, he was quite clear that should there be a second referendum, he would vote in favour of Remain. So I don't think in the end, obviously I'm asked this a lot, wasn't it Labour's fault that we lost the referendum? Well, I don't think so. I think the reason we lost the referendum actually was because we shouldn't probably have been having the referendum in the first place. The referendum was largely a problem within the Conservative Party. Now, the British Conservative Party has been conflicted by Europe for 40 years, and the real division in Britain is within the Conservative Party. And when I look across the benches in Westminster, what I see is about half of the Conservative MPs, probably more, know that this is completely foolish. But the problem they've got is that their party is dominated and now run by some extremists who have pretty much captured the Conservative Party, the people who made John Major's life so difficult when he was Prime Minister, are now effectively running the Conservative Party. Now, if they could get over that, then actually Britain could get over it. The truth is, most people, I've done 7 general elections in Britain as a candidate, which means I speak to many, many people. The British electioneering system is very straightforward. You just go and knock on people's doors and talk to them, basically. Mostly people are busy watching TV, worrying about their kids, and aren't that interested in talking about politics. But you do get some sense of what's bothering people. And I can say hand on heart that over 7 general elections, very few people ever raise the European Union as an issue. A handful do. It was an obsession of a part of the Conservative Party, but for political historians, they will ask the question, how did this issue come to dominate British politics? And the answer was people like Nigel Farage and 1 or 2 others in the Conservative Party were very, very effective. He never was able to win a parliamentary election, but as he has proclaimed, he actually won the biggest issue of all. And that is a real puzzle for the political class and for political historians.
Well, thank you very much again for your talk. I have actually 2 comments. One is, as you just said, in my personal opinion, none of the 2 parties has won or lost, because the votes were 52 to 48. So it clearly shows that there was an imbalance of either to leave or to stay. If it was, for instance, a 2/3 majority, I think it would have been more representative at all. So we would have had a clearer point of view of the British society, either to stay or to leave, regardless of the reasons why the referendum was done in the first place. And the second question or comment is, we are now in the 30th anniversary of the Erasmus program, and I think it was the best that the European Union could have ever done for social mobility of young people at all. Many people have benefited from it. I myself did. I went to Portugal. I met my wife there, and so cross-cultural relations. Many people did the same, so Erasmus was one of the best that could have ever happened. But on the other hand, Erasmus had a big failure until today, because it was only for higher education, as we all know. And if it would have included carpenters, electricians, or also just like people that are learning professions, so to say, to get their working experience abroad, it would have had a wider approach to the, I'm not going to say lower classes, because this is socially incorrect, but you know, it would have not been such for only for an exclusive club, but also for the other people, for other members of society in a broader sense. And I would like to hear your opinions about that. Thank you very much.
Can I just comment on, there are programs actually for people like you've mentioned. There are programs for trainees and exchange programs, European exchange programs, but nobody really knows about them. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that it's a language problem. Coming back to why it's so important for the language center, right?
No, you are both absolutely right. First of all, on the 52-48 issue, yep, absolutely. Most countries would require a supermajority of one sort for a major piece of constitutional change. The problem for the UK is referendums aren't part of our constitutional system. They're generally used by political leaders when they've got a problem and want to sidestep it, which is the case which Harold Wilson did for Labour when Britain came into the European Union, and David Cameron did for the Conservatives when the current problem occurred. And of course, only 37% of people in Britain did actually vote to leave. But we have Britain has this very much sort of, winner-loser thing. If you win, doesn't matter if you win by 1, you've won. It's a pretty stupid way of making a decision, and a lot of people feel that. But there is a sense, and this is a problem for people like me, that people are saying, you lost, get over it, we're moving on now. I tend to say, okay, I lost, we're moving on, but where exactly are we moving on to? And of course, that they can't answer, because they voted to leave without knowing where they were going. And it's a very reasonable point. And we have to be careful with language, actually, because the wrong language can actually make this whole divide worse. And sometimes people like me actually are guilty of that. So I'm speaking fairly brazenly today. Sometimes I choose my words slightly more carefully, probably speaking to a UK audience. But on Erasmus, you see, if I went around parts of Cambridge and talked about Erasmus, people would know what I was talking about, exactly as you've said and exactly as Thomas has said. If I went to Great Yarmouth, which is a coastal town 50 miles away, very deprived, voted strongly to leave, no one would have any idea what I was talking about. And exactly as you've said, had there been the same kind of opportunities for those people, but I think as Thomas has said, they wouldn't be in a position probably to take advantage of them, because to do those things you need the confidence, you also need the economic the economic confidence. For a lot of people, the money runs out at the end of the week. So the idea of going somewhere else to a different country is unthinkable. If you look at who has got the passports and who doesn't have passports in the UK, it is very clear. And if you look, research has been done on this, the socioeconomic profile of people who voted which way, it is quite clearly down to levels of educational attainment and economic confidence. That's why cities like mine in Cambridge vote one way. Having said that, the 24% or 26% who didn't vote to remain in Cambridge, we know exactly where they are too. They are in the poorer parts of the city. And Cambridge has poor parts too. So the divisions are everywhere. And partly, all of this is a failure of politics and failure of social policy in the wider sense over a prolonged period, for which we all have to share responsibility, I'm afraid. Well, not you, but I do.
Hello. At first, dear Mr. Zeichner, we have some things in common, especially you as a member of the Labour Party, me as a member of the Social Democratic Party here in Germany. You are more than 30 years in the party, and I'm just 8 years in the party. And what I want to disagree with you, because we never needed the conservative parties to celebrate conservative laws, to publish conservative laws, especially if we take a look to Tony Blair, because it wasn't just Cameron, it was Blair who authorized, I'm sorry, my English, to tuition fees in the UK, and also Gerhard Schröder. He was, in my point of view, one of the worst politicians of the Social Democratic Party. I'm sorry, I'm very left-wing. I'm familiar with this, yeah. So I think I'm sorry, but we failed to promote the idea of Europe, especially for the normal human beings who don't have a bachelor degree or higher educated degree. And so I want to ask you, from like a young girl to an older man, what is your idea of Europe? How can we, as the Labour Party of Europe, convince the inhabitants of the EU from our values, from what kind of challenge and also chances do we have now? We have to focus. Thanks.
It's a very important point, because you will know the Labour Party has gone through a huge change in Britain in the last few years, with Jeremy Corbyn elected as leader. Very, very different from Tony Blair, very different from Gerhard Schröder. And it's been an extraordinary time, because our party has gone from 180,000 members to 500,000 members plus. People wrote the Labour Party off in the general election, and we didn't win, but we did much better than people anticipated. My majority went from tiny 500 to 12,500. So there's lots to be optimistic about at the moment, and we have every expectation that Labour will win the next election in Britain when it happens. So I know that you've just had a tough election here in Germany, and we have been through that experience in Britain a number of times. So there is solidarity between members of the Labour Party and members of the SPD. On Europe, I just think it goes back to some of my comments earlier. I think the reasons people join parties of the left is because we are optimists, we hope for a better future, we think things can be better, we think we can change the world. A lot of it is about peace. And I think that's why talking about the European Union in positive terms, it's probably different from the way you discuss it in Germany, from the way we discuss it in the United Kingdom. I think we have got to be much more positive and constructive about it. And I think for a lot of young people, that argument is made. That's why, although Jeremy Corbyn is seen as a bit of a sceptic, actually the new members who have joined the Labour Party, by and large, are not sceptical about Europe. They're optimistic. It's because they want to be part of an internationalist order. The left has always been internationalist, not always perhaps in an entirely, how can I put this, practical way. But I just think the European Union, when you see the way it has its discussions, the way it resolves differences, these are things that we should be proud of and talk about positively. And I think those of us who've got some experience of it, there's a responsibility on us to talk much more positively about it. And with Blair, I mean, Blair was a pro-European, but he was a pragmatist all the time. And I think too often he allowed worries about what the electorate were going to think, what the Daily Mail was going to think, to govern his discourse. And I suspect, looking back on it, he would probably say that too, that he should have been bolder. I mean, in fact, there were splits within the Labour Party then. I think Blair actually wanted to take Britain into the euro. Now, who knows what might have happened if Britain had done that. In Britain, the general view is it would have been a disaster, but people in Britain always think that about everything. So actually, of course, it may well have been that having particularly a key financial player within the euro as a counterpoint to what I think many in Europe see as the power of Germany within the financial system, it could have actually made the euro more successful than it has been. I mean, I would say actually, despite everything, the fact the euro is still here has confounded many people's expectations. So I'm not here to defend Blair particularly, although I would defend many of the things that his government did. Britain changed to being a much better place during that time. There were many things that we didn't get right, but there is always a danger in always knocking what previous Labour administrations had done, because if you keep doing that, you then can't expect people to vote Labour. If you say, oh, last Labour government was rubbish, but vote for us now. Actually, there was lots that was done right. I think this is very unpopular to say in Britain. I think actually allowing people to move from the accession countries of Europe into Britain was the right thing to do then. Most of us thought that then. Now we say it was the wrong thing. Well, I think I said it at the time and I stick by it. I think it was the right thing. The fact that your uncle was able to come and others have come has been good for Britain. But I understand that a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that. But so I don't think Blair was necessarily the problem. What we've got to do is fashion a new version that's actually not fit for looking back, but fit for looking forward. And that's the challenge for me and my colleagues in the Labour Party now. We may have, who knows when the next election will be in Britain. It may not be for 4.5 years. But if we win that election, there's a real responsibility on us to make sure that we get it right. Because if we don't, then Labour will be in opposition again in Britain probably for another 10 or 15 years. This is what happens. And I can't give advice for your party here in Germany, other than to say I do think the Merkel phenomenon is a slightly unusual one historically and difficult. I can quite understand how difficult it was to campaign against her. And I have sympathy with that because we had that situation. I'm not saying that Merkel and Thatcher are similar, but when you get a very powerful leader like that, who's long established, it is quite hard to campaign against them, particularly if people feel in the end, well, I might not necessarily agree with that person, but we know that person and we'll stick with them. That's not the situation we've got in Britain at the moment, which is why no one's going to feel that about Theresa May. So we've got a real opportunity to win. But in the end, it's got to come back to the values. A positive vision for the future that can be generous, but also make sure that you're constantly reassuring the people who you are there to represent that you're going to make sure that their standard of living is going to improve. And that's what Labour's got to do for the people, all the people who are frightened and worried at the moment. And that is a real worry for them, because in a time of insecure jobs, low pay in the labour market, actually we've got to have the policies so they know absolutely certainly that their lives will be better. And I think we can make that offer, and I think then we will have their support.
We were thinking we could take 2 more questions, if there are 2 more questions. Maybe here? Yes? Lucas, is there a microphone floating? Yeah.
Thank you for the lovely talk. I'm wondering whether you think a referendum on the final Brexit deal should be held, and if you will be participating on the debate regarding the set question, which will be tabled on December 11th. Thank you.
So effectively, should there be another referendum? Yeah. I think a lot of us, after the previous one, decided we'd never like another referendum again because it was so awful. And part of the problem was that it was a very ill-informed discussion. Most people, if there'd been a second question on the paper, do you know enough to make a decision, that would have had an overwhelming majority in Britain. Most people didn't know, really. So a lot of them, in the end, it was a heart rather than head decision. And in their hearts, a lot of people thought, no. But their heads, if they'd thought a bit longer about it, and if they'd actually known how much it was going to cost, this is one of the questions I put to people who've been saying we should leave. I say, you know, countries can go their own way, you know, and there used to be what was called the Albanian road to socialism. Most young people in Albania wanted to leave at the time. There's North Korea. You know, you can run a very poor independent, actually you can't, because in the end you depend upon another client, but the idea of Britain going it alone in the modern world, which is what some of those people want, yes, well maybe we could, but we'd probably all be eating, you know, turnip soup, and it would be very grim. And there's nobody in Britain who would sign up for that. But it was never explained how much it might cost. Now, if it was marginal, you know, 0.5% of national income, maybe people would say, well, that's a fair trade-off. But if it's 10 or 20%, which is beginning to be what it looks like, and for people who are at the bottom, losing 10 or 20% of their income is huge, it's the difference between having anything left at the end of the week and nothing, then most of those people, if that was put to them, would say, well, I'm not going to do that. So there was no honesty in the referendum. And the question then is, does one think a second referendum would be any better? And that is a worry to me. But the counter-argument is, if you've had one, you can't overturn it without having another. So I think the debate is moving gradually in favour of a second decision. Now, that decision could be taken in Parliament, and this is partly what you're driving at. And there's actually been an argument yet again this week in the UK Parliament, because David Davis, astonishingly, managed to suggest this week that Parliament could have a debate on it, or a decision on it, after we've left, which seems fairly pointless, really, because he clearly believes there won't be a decision until the very last minute. It'll be one of those situations where the European Union stops the clock, you know, at 1 minute to midnight and goes on talking about it for a couple of hours. So how do you have a decision in Parliament on it? But of course that begs the question, there's also got to be a decision in the European Parliament. So a lot of this cannot work, in my view. In the end, and I think I alluded to this earlier, Britain can only change its mind if the public has clearly changed its mind. So I think it will depend upon the politics of it in broader sense. If it begins to become apparent that the public has rethought it, then you either have a general election, which is the traditional way of doing it, where the Labour Party, and this is where there is a real challenge for the Labour Party, could the Labour Party be persuaded to be very clear, to be bold and say, no, we think the deal isn't good enough, in which case we should stay. That's a political risk for Labour, and I don't know whether we could do that. If not, then probably the default is another referendum, which obviously we have to win, because if we lost it a second time, then that's it, finished. So these are high stakes, big risks, but I think in the end that will be the political choice near the end. I do think that we are testing Europe's patience, frankly, taking it to the wire in that kind of way, because this all has big implications for you too, because it will not only be Britain that's an economic loser if we come out, it will have a substantial effect on other European countries who trade in Britain. So we know that it cuts both ways. So we're taking a huge chance with this. But if we are to change it, it will need at some point either a decision in a referendum or in an election.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for. I heard you said something about politicians in your country, which I found very interesting. You go to other countries and talk about Brexit, yeah? and the implications about. Could you tell us which are the most important highlights or impacts that you have in these other countries, or maybe your party have learned in this way, that you now are going out, like here in Germany or maybe in other countries?
So what are you taking back? That's the question.
Well, first of all, what I'll take back is, can I start by saying thank you for very informed questions, for still being engaged in this after an hour and a half of discussion. I find it very impressive and encouraging. I suspect you're not entirely typical of everyone in your countries. You're a group of very well-informed young people. What I think you raise a very important point. I don't think many British politicians are going into Europe to try and understand what other people are thinking. I have a very good friend who's a member of the European Parliament who used to work with me, and we often share platforms. And what she frequently tries to say to people in Britain is, you do not understand what people in Europe feel about this. Now, a lot of people in Britain say, well, we don't really care, which is a typical British attitude. And on one level, that is probably the case. People aren't that worried about it, but particularly for those of us involved politically, who do take a wider view, we should care what other people think, because if you don't take any notice of what other countries think and what other people are saying, not only can it ultimately lead to conflict, but when you look at just how closely, Britain is a trading nation, all our prosperity is actually based on working with other people. And what I think is interesting is that people who are actually engaged in it do understand it better. The big problem is that most people aren't. And it's a failure of communication within our own country, which is the problem. It's the difficulty of people like me not being able to, in some ways, connect with the probably 60–70% of people who are not engaged in any of this. So that's the challenge. But what I will very much take back from today and from the visit in general is just how even more convinced I am that Britain gains from a close relationship with the European Union, and just how much we have in common. You know, people talk about our common European home. Well, it is. It absolutely is. I look at the universities, I look at the buildings in your town here, I look at Berlin. We are Europeans. And Britain is a country which is largely peopled by people who've come, actually, if you go back over time, from other parts of Europe and other parts of the world. And we should celebrate and embrace that. And that's why I'm Labour, but it's also why I'm a European. And I will finish on that note.
Thank you very much. Excellent final words. Thank you very much, Daniel, for sharing your views, insights, your optimism with us. And we keep our fingers crossed that people like you become the majority in Britain, and that we, in a few years' time, we will come back as a minister, transport, a Labour Party minister, and Brexit will be a term we have to explain to students because they don't know anything about it. Thank you very much for all your questions. Thanks for being here, and have a good weekend.